Thank you for returning. The fearful condition. Fear is one of the persistent hounds of hell that dog the footsteps of the poor, the dispossessed, and the disinherited. With these words, Howard Thurman begins his diagnosis of the maladies that hunt and haunt the disinherited. The way Thurman describes fear, in fact, makes it the emperor of all maladies, to borrow from the title of Siddhartha Mukherjee's famous text. Fear, like cancer, may seem ubiquitous. Fear carries, as Thurman understood it, ecological dimensions, forming as a currency that moves reciprocally through and between every institution and the social relations between the poor and those with overwhelming power. It is, as he says, and I quote, nowhere in particular, but everywhere. I want us to consider not just fear's liquidity, but also its constituting power as it seeks to establish definitive shape to the building, the body, and the design, and their relations. My friends, we are considering the redemption of habitation through the joint salvation of the body and the building, of the creating and the designing. My first lecture drew attention to the possibility of dwelling, introduced to us through the life of Mary with Jesus, and then the life of Jesus inside the teaching of Mary through her testimony and her life in the land. What unfolds through the life of Jesus is not only the voice of God, but also the voice of the land. That is the semiosis of creation embodied in Jesus. Jesus draws those who follow him into the unfolding of his life with God through the Spirit, and therefore into his own dreaming of the reign of God being realized in and through his life, down to the bone and the dirt. And from the bone and the dirt, new possibilities, new designs for living and building may emerge. To follow me here, we must resist separating an interior life from the built environment. We must refuse bifurcating bodies and buildings, movements and operations of neighborhoods from the formation of subjectivities. We must see dreaming inside of designing and designing inside dreaming. And all of it, my friends, either bound to the possibilities of dwelling or bound to destructive forms of habitation. The first form of tragic habitation that we must consider is one constituted through fear. Fear does not distort habitation. Fear creates distorted habitation. This is saying much more than fear drives the establishing of borders, boundaries, and the structures of security, or that fearful people create places that they may hide. Fear in relation to habitation is a constituting reality that is itself constituted through sacrality, through the sacred. Indeed, fear and sacrality are woven together in the building, the body, and design. Woven together today in the building, the body, and design as two mutually enhancing energies. What does it mean for a place to be sacred? And what does it mean to make a place sacred? What does it mean for a human creature to be sacred? Or for a non-human creature to be sacred? These have been exceedingly important questions for Christian theology, as well as for so many indigenous peoples. And these questions have been difficult to answer on this side of colonial modernity and the translation of the world into owned existence and the transformation of all that is into property or on its way to becoming property. Our vision of a propertied world has colonized the idea of sacrality. That colonization grew through the reformation of the ideas of the sacred through modern slavery and the formation of the plantation. As we noted in the last lecture, we inhabit histories that have dulled our senses to the unfreedom created through our creativity. We inhabit histories that have dulled our senses to the unfreedom created through our creativity. A vignette. My friend finally got the brownstone apartment he longed for in the city. Old building in a black neighborhood, he was the point of a gentrification spear. Brought up, bought up, fixed up, he moved into 1,100 square feet. He buzzed me in, and I knocked at the door, and the barks reached through the door and grabbed me. I did not prejudge until the door opened, and then two big dogs, one a Rottweiler, big face, even bigger muscles, greeted me on tight leashes, my friend barely holding them back. Don't worry, he said, don't worry. Let them smell you. I stepped in, they growled. They did not relax. I did not relax. We stood in the living room and talked, still not relaxed. We ordered food. Food came. We sat at the table and ate. Dogs at our feet, not relaxed. Moving through the apartment spaces, dogs following, we talked about paints and fixtures and countertops and lights and furniture and window treatments, not relaxed. Talked about his hope for the neighborhood, definitely not relaxed. Got late and dark, time to go. Once I left his place, got outside, my feet on the street, I took time to exhale. I felt very safe, and I slowly walked to my car. If we remain in long histories of distorted creative activity rooted in the logic of the afterlife of the plantation, then slavery haunts our creativity. Plantation, as I said, is a placeholder for every form of habitation that weaves body, building, and design into captivity. In this regard, we should consider the production of one of Terra Christiana's most insidious effects, the formation of sacred places that compel their veneration and protection. The formation of sacred places that compel their veneration and protection, where real estate practices, racial and class hierarchies, and policing practice converge to structure what I call priestly enclosures. Priestly enclosures. It is the creation of priestly enclosures that show us the weaving of fear and sacrality in their constituting energies. A passage of Scripture, Exodus chapter 32, verses 1 through 4. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Come, make gods for us, who shall go before us. As for this Moses, this man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." And Aaron said to them, "Take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took these from them, formed them in a mold, and cast an image of a calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." This text captures a moment of spiritual retreat in both senses of that word. The people there at the foot of God's holy mountain surround Aaron, enclose him in their desire to have him recreate the benefits of bondage. The request to make our gods in the presence of the God of Israel reconstitutes one side of a slave society in its idol production, where circulates delusion, hatred, but especially fear. The people have been torn from the familiar, brought to a strange place, and left in a state of political and social terrain by Moses. They are captured by their fears of the unknown and fear of the enemies, of their enemies. There they enact the fundamental delusion of idol worship, and in so doing articulate hatred for God down to the bone and the dirt. The gold they take from their ears, that central place of obedience, signify their enslavement even as they stand in the space of freedom. There the people turn back from the trajectory of freedom actualized by the divine presence, and they map a zone of repass. A zone of repass amid a holy place. If a repass is a place where the dead are remembered and celebrated within the work of comforting the mourners, then this repass both mourns the loss of a way of life and celebrates its remnant now being established geographically on the ground in that space of unholy request. Priestly enclosures, my friends, priestly enclosures are habitations that create zones of repass. These zones of repass endlessly energize the remnant production of slaves and masters through building, bodies, and design, self-generating, and self-sufficient. Priestly enclosures create a counterfeit sacrality formed amid the sacred. A counterfeit sacrality formed amid the sacred. This is where, friends, this is where we can see fear and sacrality in mutually creative mobilization. But it is also where we must grasp the grounded reality of whiteness. The grounded reality of whiteness. What is whiteness? I have articulated whiteness against the simple collapse of its reality onto the bodies of people of European descent who self-identify as white people. Whiteness is a way of being in the world, a way of seeing the world, and a way of being recognized in the world all at the same time. Whiteness is a way of materializing one's desire to order the world through building, bodies, and design at the horrific cost to peoples. Born of the ways European colonial settlers configured their living and the living of indigenous peoples, whiteness roots a master-slave dialectic into the ground itself, establishing relentless parasitic relations between people at the point of the built environment. This can be seen between cities, between city areas and other city areas, between neighborhoods, hamlets, villages, between colleges and universities and their host cities and communities. The master-slave relation is not new, nor are vassal relations between outposts of servitude and centers of empire. Whiteness, however, grounds this abiding servitude within an ideology of freedom, in the nurturing of a predatory self, a master hidden in plain sight, revealed by the built environment itself. A master hidden in plain sight, revealed by the built environment itself. This is a civilized form of predation that rides on the winds of race and capitalism, disseminated through the logics of property ownership. Another vignette, or maybe it's a poem, I'm not quite sure. This was reported on the Sunday News show as an interest story, light entertainment. The reporter said, smiling through her perfect white teeth, "There is an old colonial footprint now being filled freshly." Why was she smiling? New communities are popping up all over the old Caribbean, Hawaiian, African, Pacific island outposts, where people from the United States, Canada, Australia, South Africa, and all over Europe are buying up land and building large and beautiful retreat homes and even hotels. The reporter continued to smile. There, they are serviced by the locals, that is, non-white peoples. These enlightened settlers celebrate the development they are bringing to these lands as they sequester beaches, woodland areas, pathways gentle and complex, and even sand dunes. They close off every beautiful way to the water, now protected by armed security. No one else allowed, even if you were born there. They capture stunning vistas steal the sound of wind flowing through ancient places, and greed away marvelous views of it all. From the rising of the sun to the going down of the same, they own it. And the reporter said, still smiling, their names are to be praised. Priestly enclosures foment practices of veneration and protection. Priestly enclosures foment practices of veneration and protection. From lawns to libraries, from castles to golf courses, from gated communities to heritage mansions with guided hush tours through them. We venerate all the time. We venerate all the time. And real estate practices and the work of developers teach us to deepen our veneration. What does this mean? It means that our attempts to establish an ethic of care and concern for the earth and for people through claims to the world's sacredness, the world's sacrality, has already been exhausted by a vision of the world as property. A property world will always be and become a venerated world. It will also become and be a segregated world. And such a world will always generate fear and precarity, especially for those left outside veneration and those peoples left outside being seen as part of those sacred places. Here, my friends, here is where we must meditate on the reality of homelessness. Homelessness sits at the center of the fearful condition as more than just a problem, but as the precise outcome of a world translated into owned existence. This is the first reason homelessness exists, because priestly enclosures exist. Because places have been formed in veneration and protection through real estate practices, race and class hierarchies, and policing practice that create zones of repass that position everyone outside of them as potentially both slave and prey, P-R-E-Y. A poem that's also a vignette entitled Going Uphill. I walked up to the church set on a marvelous hill high in San Francisco, California. I believe it was California Street that I was walking on. Grace Cathedral. Its name spoke a truth as I walked up the hill from my hotel to the church. As I walked, slightly labored up that hill, every 20 feet or so, I saw it. Men and women, children, some black, some white, some Latinx, clothes and furniture and toys, blankets, towels, and bags, large and small. All of it on the street, like a staged play pretending to be in a house. They looked at me as though I was rudely walking through their living room and that I should pay attention to where I am. And then another 20 feet or so, and I saw it again. Young, old, some bent over, others trying to organize life in the open air. And again, they looked at me as though I should pay attention to where I am. Finally, after seeing it again several more times, I arrived at stunningly beautiful Grace Cathedral. I gathered myself for a moment, standing in grace, shaken to my core by where I am. If those who are homeless are in the position of the slave and the condition of prey, exposed to the elements and predators, then they inhabit a violent geography that not only immerses them in danger, but also encloses them in what Thurman understood as artificial limitations. These artificial limitations run through bodies and buildings, and we should add, of course, borders. Homelessness, as we all know, is a global problem precisely because it is a problem of artificial limitations formed within human-created problems, including war, forced migration, climate upheaval, exile, famine, and poverty. Yet the artificial is real because these limitations are grounded in the global politics of segregation. The global politics of segregation. Segregation, as you all know, is an ancient practice. It has always been in league with genocide, and often a precursor to it, to sequester people, to limit their movement and options for where they may live or even imagine living, is to bring an evaluative question to their very existence. Why should they live here? That question forefronts their use value as a prerequisite to engagement, to concern, and care. It also exposes the power of segregation to be wielded by those with economic resources, social capital, policing power, and political advantage to dictate the geographic configurations for the many. Thurman, while observing the sequestering practices of the United States and in other parts of the world, recognized that segregation reformats the world and renders a racialized landscape as natural. Segregation is to homelessness what waterways are to fish, the very reality within which it lives and moves. Yet, yes, it is true that homelessness also has to do with the internal configurations of the geography of nation states, the effects of climate change, the relation between nation states, the operations of the market, especially regarding land speculation and development, and the designs of housing and habitat, guided by the desires of real estate. But homelessness emerges out of our segregated structuring of habitation, where we find constellations of priestly enclosures. Segregation in this way is not just a practice. It's not just a practice of sequestering land, pathways, movements, and people. It is also a way to ensure that the weaving of sacrality and fear continue precisely in the ways bodies and built environments come to be in the world. A poem for you. Museums and maps. Museums and maps. Here you must see. You should linger as long as possible. Take in the beauty, the magnificence. Feel the history. Touch transcendence. Present camera and pose human statues. For a moment, mimic this place. Be one with it. Align yourself with its permanence. There, you must avoid at all cost. Acknowledge your fragility of bone and blood. Map your movements around and away from there. Protect your life. Forget that place. Their human refuse. That for a long moment mimic that place. At one with its abandonment, aligned with decay. As you move about, sometimes, if you allow your senses to pay long attention, you will feel the spine beneath your feet, the heartbeat moving up from the ground, matching your own. Then you will have to decide whether to admit it's your body. It is precisely how we come to be in this world, the contours of our grounded existence that make the fearful condition a matter of the body and the building and the designing and the dreaming. One of Howard Thurman's most famous statements about segregation and segregation's relation to fear has become a timeless observation, and I quote, "The fear that segregation inspires among the weak, in turn, breeds fear among the strong and the dominant. This fear insulates the conscience against a sense of wrongdoing in carrying out a policy of segregation. For it counsels that if there were no segregation, there would be no protection against invasion of the home, the church, or the school." In seeking to address the problem of fear, Thurman turns rightly to Jesus, but he also turns to Mary. Thurman concludes that the first words Jesus speaks against fear in Luke echo the words of Mary also in Luke. Jesus in the synagogue reciting those words of the prophet Isaiah, the Spirit on him, realizing his anointing, enabling him to preach deliverance to the captives, setting people free. Those words are also inside the words of Mary. God scattering the proud in their imaginations, putting down the mighty from their seats of power, filling the hungry with good things, and sending the rich away without gain. Thurman chooses texts that unfold the life of Jesus inside the life of Mary. And so doing, he positions Jesus like Mary, articulating a reality of freedom at the site of captivity to hatred and fear. What mobilizes the freedom of Jesus against fear, according to Thurman, is Jesus' recognition of what the land and animals teach us about not only God's care, but who we are. Thurman cites Matthew chapter 10, verses 26 through 30, only part of which I will recite here. "Have no fear of them, for nothing is covered up that will not be uncovered, and nothing secret that will not become known. Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father, and even the hairs on your head are all counted. So do not be afraid, for you are of more value than many sparrows." Thurman then quotes Luke chapter 12, verse 32. "Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." He finishes his volley of scripture with those words from the Sermon on the Mount and from Matthew 6, which says most clearly speak against fear, and what Thurman calls, its twin sons of thunder, anxiety and despair. Again, quoting in part, that passage. Do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not clothed like one of these. But if God so clothed the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? Thurman then draws these texts to a singularly beautiful interpretive end. That nature itself told Jesus and now tells us that we are children of God. Here, Thurman aligns his own well-documented and famous revelatory sense of nature with Jesus himself, and in this regard turns us back to the work of Jesus giving voice for plant and animal. As we noted in that first lecture, the land does not speak in the same way that Jesus speaks to others. The land immerses him in its communicative density. And Jesus allows the land to think itself through him, Jesus invites such immersion when he tells us to look and consider. Look and consider. Actions that eventually find their home in what will emerge in the history of Christian practice as the contemplative life. Yet with Jesus, we meet the call to an intensification of attentiveness, one that would directly address the fearful condition. Thurman's Jesus, and the one I want to hold up, knows he is a child of God. He knows he is a child of God because that knowing is grounded in the Spirit and in the dirt, ecologically as well as pneumatologically. It could be that a similar communicative density is characteristic of his fleshly life in the Spirit. This knowing, born of spirit and dirt, establishes a reality of belonging, activated through yielding to the Spirit and listening and learning from plant and animal, rain and wind. Together, they challenge the power of fear. Thurman states the following, unfortunately in non-inclusive language, but he states the following. A man's conviction that he is God's child automatically tends to shift the basis of his relationship with all his fellows. He recognizes at once that to fear a man, whatever may be that man's power over him, is a basic denial of the integrity of his own life. I want to draw Thurman's antidote to fear into a wider work of redeeming veneration at the site of the built environment. When it comes to the built environment, to redeem veneration is not the same operation as ending idolatry. To end idolatry is to end the worship of that which must not be worshiped because it is a creature. To redeem veneration is to align the creature and the creation toward the worship of God. Here we must return to the nature of the sacred and to those questions that circle around the one question: what is sacred? What is sacred? It is the life of Jesus that guides us into a fruitful recognition and realization of what sacrality entails. Jesus, from his baptism, enters the sanctification of God and shows us the character of the sacred. The descending Spirit, or as theologian Mark Wallace terms the Spirit bird, draws Jesus into the truth that he is sanctified by God, and thereby turns that truth out into the world. Turns that truth out into the world. The spirit bird not only positions the life of Jesus against fear, but also clarifies the path of veneration. But unlike Wallace, I do not believe that the spirit descending in the form of a bird constitutes an invitation toward veneration of birds and of all creation, nor any practice of worship of our creaturely kin, as some theologians have called our creaturely kin. Sacrality with Jesus forms in and through the Spirit as a way of sensing and understanding the embracing of God, of the creation, and the joy of God of being embraced by the creature. The spirit bird descends in resting touch on Jesus, in concert with the caressing of the waters of baptism. The sacred is in the embrace. The sacred is in the embrace, creating the conditions for dwelling. God embracing the creation and being embraced by creatures gives us the level of precision we need in thinking sacrality at the site of unfreedom, where that embrace is being denied daily. Here we touch on the logic of the prophetic practice of Israel, summarized with Mary, that Jesus intensifies through his life. He will testify to God's caressing and caring for the creature and the creation itself, taking hold of the life of this child of God, establishing a freedom that will not yield. It is that prophetic practice of Jesus that must be brought to the building, the body, and the design today. They must be placed between the reality of divine embrace of the creation and with Jesus experiencing the embrace of the creature. This placement recapitulates that moment of Mount Sinai for Israel, where human creatures exist in the presence of God, waiting to learn how to live with God, waiting to build in response to the divine embrace of creation, and to build out a practice of veneration. Build out a practice of veneration. This then would be a practice of veneration that builds out from the divine embrace, similar to what the theologian John of Damascus spoke of when he spoke of iconography and the devotion to icons. For John of Damascus, the incarnation establishes a reality of veneration that collaborates with the disclosure of the divine life. The icon brings us into a practice of making that is already inside reflected glory, and thereby offers a perception in the making and a making of a perception by directing our senses toward the divine embrace of the creature. Icons are venerated, not worshiped, because they reach out to us, allowing us to sense by the Spirit divine touch. That reaching out, because it is rooted in Jesus, where matter has been taken up into divine life, means that icons and iconographers may seek to do a work aligned with salvation, down to the bone and dirt. In like manner, I want to suggest a work of veneration at the site of the built environment that situates our creativity in the freedom Jesus makes real. That work of veneration must be turned against the practice of veneration and the cultivation of fear constituted by priestly enclosures. The question, my friends, is not What is not, should we call the world sacred, or human life or creaturely life sacred? The question is, how do we materialize that sacrality in the built environment? If sacrality is realized and recognized in the embrace, then we must address the fearful condition inside a destructive work. Collapsing priestly enclosures and dismantling zones of repast. What is at stake in this work is thwarting the constant recreations of the master-slave relation through the shaping of landscapes and communities, towns, hamlets, and cities. What is at stake is the collapsing of the very conditions that make homelessness possible and that make segregation such an attractive strategy for controlling one's world. The words of Jesus, "Fear not," need to be enacted, not simply in the interior life, my friends, the interior life of a believer, but in the very structure of the built environment. The built environment must say the words, "Fear not." Yet fear, as Thurman noted so powerfully, is rooted in violence, and there are violent people who create violent spaces and produce through that violence fearful places. Yet Howard Washington Thurman was not convinced by the power of violence to close off a signifying world from us, silencing the truth that we are children of God. He saw in the prophetic word of Jesus the power to set people free from the cycles of violence. I see that as well. But not just in our subjectivities and our behavior, but also and especially in the buildings and the design. Could we imagine the refashioning of our built environments and our lives embedded in them to allow plant and animal, water and air to immerse us in the truth that we are children of God, and to echo that truth through practices of care structured into the way places are built and the way communities are shaped? Could we restructure the ways of engagement created by buildings and neighborhoods, hamlets, and roadways? Answering these questions in the affirmative requires we rethink not just the shape of our communities, but also the ways our communities are shaped in the fearful condition, and in turn, shape fear. Yet to address the fearful condition, as we have presented here, requires we turn next to what Howard Thurman called deception and self-deception, what I will address as the deeper problem of ownership, and what I call the condition of delusion. And that will be for the next lecture. Thank you so much.
We do have a little bit of time for questions today, but I just want to flag that next week, after lectures 3 and 4 in the morning, there will be a seminar in the afternoon, which you will be able to really dig deep, both with Willie and with Anthony Reddy, our own Oxford theologian, who will offer some preliminary comments on that occasion. So that will be next Tuesday from 2:30 to 4 at Harris Manchester College. But we do have a little moment for some questions now, if anyone has any, and we have a roving mic. Yes, Professor Jelks, hang on for the mic.
Professor, oh, now it is on. Professor Jennings, we're in a built environment. Your comments tend toward capitalism, which is right, but this built environment also reflected a sense of power and exclusion as well. Can you comment more about that? And sorry to be the historian here, but what has changed in those two moments? Because this equally built environment speaks of sacrality and power.
Thank you, Dr. Jokes, for that wonderful question. It is true that we all inhabit spaces that we did not create, places not of our own choosing or making. And so this fine question from Dr. Jokes brings us to how do we understand our placement in such places? Well, here what's crucial for us is to recognize that we are inside histories that often we are unaware of. And so the crucial question is, how is that history reflected in buildings, yet exerting itself upon us? This is the missing link for us, that we are inside an intentionality with every building. And to ask ourselves, what is the intention? How is this building intended to work upon how I see the world? Is itself a crucial question that's, on, as I say, at the doorsteps of redemption. And that's what I want people to begin to ask. What is being asked of me by the spaces I inhabit? Not only inside buildings such as these, but in the neighborhoods that I live in the way the roadways work, and how my life is shaped, for example, around the car. What is being asked of me? Who am I to be as I inhabit this? Here's where we must remember, my dear friends. All design reflects an intentionality. All design reflects a wish for how we would be, not only in terms of our behavior, but our subjective states. And the question we must learn to ask now is, what was the intention? What was the wish? What was the desire? And whose was it? Thank you, Dr. Jokes, for that very fine question.
Professor Jennings, thank you so much for your talk.
Tell us your name, please.
Sorry?
Tell us your name, please.
Oh, sorry about that. My name is Eduardo. I'm a student here, a DPhil student at Blackfriars Hall. I wanted to ask you a question about the use of the three main words that you've been describing: building, body, and in design. Yes. I see how describing these words enables you to sort of develop an idea of our relationships, right? And our relationship with the places that we inhabit, but also the bodies that we inhabit. But I was wondering, although it does empower you because it underlines or stresses the fact that this is a result of your decisions, you can transform them and you should, doesn't the use of these specific words sort of preserve a distance that I think you're trying to bridge? In a sense, we don't just inhabit our bodies and our surroundings, we are our bodies as well. And maybe that's one of the reasons why transforming our approach to how we dwell and how we inhabit is difficult, because in a sense, you're talking about changing ourselves. Thank you.
Excellent question. So I want to hold the three, they are deeply connected, but I want to hold them up as three instances that we want to think as three instances, because each involves an intentionality that enfolds the other. And I think this is what's so important for us, that we don't imagine the three as inside of an intentionality. It's easier for us to imagine the body in terms of fashioning and fabrication and reimagining, because the body is what we work with every day. But what I want us to see is that the body is in between these other two points of intentionality. There is no building that does not require as much energy and care as the body. To care for it, to clean it, to watch over its foundations to make sure it stands, that energy. And there is no reality of the body or the building that is also not the ongoing energy of design, the initial energy that creates it, but how that then is realized each day. And as I'm going to talk about next week when we come to the next lecture, how those realities of decision are made by only a few in society. And the horror of that a few people make the decisions for the masses, but not just in terms of design, but also of the building and the body. So I want all three together so that we can see how they are a constant interworking. And if we can start to see this, let's get back to Dr. Joke's fine question, if we can start to see that we are inside an energy, less a structure, then what becomes possible, my dear brother, what becomes possible is to turn that energy in a different direction. The danger with thinking of structure is that it often leads us to think of its permanence. And theologically, those of us who are inside the Christian story know that nothing that exists is permanent, only God. And so we live against the illusion of permanence, even as that illusion has been placed inside so many buildings, inside of monument and building, that it will be forever. We know that nothing will be forever except for God. And so the question becomes, how do we enact that knowledge, that deconstructive, that breaking knowledge that allows us to see new possibilities where others don't see any possibilities? This road has been here forever. This highway is here. This set of buildings is here. This is the price points for them. We press against the permanence of the built environment for the sake of its redemption and our own.
Thank you very much, Professor Jennings. And I'm Warren Garney. I'm an architect based here in Oxford. And we particularly look at issues around homelessness, doing research, looking into affordable housing, as well as doing it in practice as well. And I'm struck by what you're saying about there's few of us who shape the built environment, and I have, I guess, in a sense, that weight of that responsibility in terms of being a designer and creator. So I guess my question is, to what extent can I, as an architect, as a creator, be an enabler for sort of this alternative vision of the world and thinking of care? And to what extent do I perhaps hand that over to the communities that we engage with to inform my practice and sort of enable them to be the ones that shape the spaces that we're designing?
Thank you. Excellent question. I'm going to speak about this directly at the next lecture, but you're touching on what for many people is the deep hope for the democratization of design, which I wholeheartedly agree that the possibility of challenging the way in which processes of design have been sequestered by the expert, and that the way in which people will be affected by those decisions are not at the table. And so it begins by a work of guerrilla warfare, of subterfuge, a work of challenging the closed door of architecture. And in many places, it's not so much what happens in the architect's offices. It's what happens in those city council meetings, those hamlet meetings, where those decisions that are made that allow for the shaping of this neighborhood, the shaping of this community, are presented, and there's no one to fight back. But it does require architects who see that there is a calling to hear the voice of the many in their work, and to enact that calling in the way they do their work, and to do so with honesty and integrity. The sociologist Sinet, I forgot his first name now, it just escapes me right now. He talks about how oftentimes those meetings where architects come and lay out their ideas to the community for how things will be designed, have built into them small deceptive devices where communities will comment on this little small thing, thinking that they now have a voice, but those little small things have nothing to do with the larger project. And so the challenge is how do we form people who are in the room when the designs are being discussed, who bring the masses into that room? That's what's crucial. So may your tribe increase and take over the world.
Thank you again for your presentation. We have just crowned a new king in the UK. You might have heard that we've been doing a bit of that. And he has inherited great wealth in land and buildings and power, and is even head of a church. I'd like to hear what place you think inheritance has in this story of dwelling.
That's a great question. There's a parallel question here that's happening in the States as many churches that have significant property holdings, because the churches are shrinking and their financial needs remain heavy, that they're selling their land. And we are in the midst of the greatest land transfer in the history of the modern world, as churches are selling their lands. Many schools have sold their land in order to survive. And so the problem is that the reality of inheritance is imagined primarily at the level of real estate and not at the level of one's deeper theological commitments. And so the question that has to be brought to everyone who has land, as I'm going to talk about next week, all advertisements for next week, is how do we think about ownership? I want to suggest that we have to rethink ownership from the ground up, and rethink our responsibilities that come with operating inside what I call a false pneumatology of dwelling, of owning. So it would bring that crucial question that Jesus asked of the rich young ruler, wouldn't it? The rich young ruler comes to Jesus and says, I've done everything I was supposed to do since I was a child. What do I lack? Terrible question to ask Jesus. What do I lack? And Jesus says, you lack nothing. So come and follow me. And by the way, give up everything you own. And the passage for us is so profound, isn't it? Because in sorrow, he turns from Jesus and walks away. But the great punchline comes with the disciples. What about us? Because we want what he has. And Jesus' response to them is, follow me. This is where the conversation must begin.
Hello, Tobias Tanton, Harris Manchester College. It's lovely to meet you yesterday. Thank you for your lecture. You gave us this beautiful phrase and vision of the built environment that must say the words, fear not. And it struck me that perhaps a lot of environments I can think of that are welcoming, open, inclusive, can be so precisely because there are borders elsewhere, and so there's still a gated community. It's just that the gate has been moved to the border or to the edge of Europe or to what have you. And so how do you think of this dynamic between the local built environment and the larger geopolitical borders? How do you think through that dynamic, and is it just the same thing on a different scale, or are there disanalogies as well between those two cases?
Wonderful question, and I beg your patience with me. I will be talking about this in the next lecture, but you are pressing on the crucial question, and it is, for me, the way in which priestly enclosure works. works at the site of the line, L-I-N-E. And this is the matter we need to think about theologically and philosophically. We have internalized the line. The line is not real, but we have made it real in us. And so the deeper theological question, my friends, we must all wrestle with, what does it mean to have the line in us? The line should not be in us, but it is. But the line being in us is not simply that we have been disciplined by it, but we have woven our sense of what is normal, what is comfortable, and what is safe inside the line. And so could it be that, to use those of us who were raised in the Baptist context, to use the Great Commission in Matthew 28, where Jesus says, go out into all the world, could we not imagine that as already the antidote for the disease that will come later? That is, the internalization of the line. That would mean that to be a follower of Jesus is to live against the line. But who dares live against the line, especially at this moment in which the line constitutes so much safety, normalcy, and comfort?
Thank you, Professor Jennings. David Williams, DPhil student at Keble College. Sorry. You said that homelessness is a global problem because of artificial limitations. And we've spent quite a bit of time in Seattle and New York City, places with severe homelessness crises. And my understanding is that the majority of the homeless population are in this predicament because they struggle with mental illness or alcohol or substance abuse or some combination of the two. And so I guess my question is, how do you think about that in relationship to your thesis? And particularly when we think about how in previous generations, people in those sorts of straits would be forcibly enclosed. But now they're not, and now they have a freedom to sleep on the streets, which they do. And so I wonder if homelessness might also be as much a problem of artificial freedoms as it is artificial limitations. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you for your question. This question raises what I think is one of the most problematic ideological responses to homelessness. And thank you for raising this. So there are just as many people with mental illness and mental challenges, with problems with abuse and of addiction, who have homes, and they are not homeless. And so the question becomes, how and why has this emerged as a way to understand a family on the street? As I was walking up that hill to Grace Cathedral, and to see these children and these grandmothers, whole families on the street, to imagine this inside of an ideology, of their agency gone awry, is to be inside someone's alibi. So I want to flip the question. What are the conditions of the environment? What are the conditions of the built environment in which mental struggle and lack of money and addiction are not, in a sense, addressed? And if not addressed, the result is homelessness. So let's flip that question. What constitutes the subjectivity that makes homelessness not only a possibility, but a delusional attraction for someone who does not really want to be out in sub-zero weather with no place to live, but they think that that's actually an option. So, and here's how we must ask ourselves this question: who is served by that alibi? Who is served by that alibi are those who want to keep their spaces safe, who want their spaces protected by the police, who want to construct individuals as predator or prey. Now, it is true that if I am in an unsafe place and there is no other safe place, then the option is, in my mind, to be away from place. But if I am in an unsafe place and I have been structured inside an unsafe place, then that's a question about the place, not about the resulting structure that I have now internalized. And here is where we have to be so careful, especially those of us who are Christian, with being too quickly to think about agency and individual choice as the first place we look to understanding the maladies of a society. Not to say that we don't think about agency, but we have to think about the way agency is constructed by the built environment. And if we do that, then I think we'll come up with a different thesis for why somebody is out on the street in sub-zero weather, up against the wall of a building, surrounded in cardboard, freezing to death, and thinking in ourselves they actually want to be here. That certainly doesn't serve them. It certainly will serve the person who owns that building who wants them moved, but not them. Thank you for that question. Great question.
So just before I thank Professor Jennings, I want to apologize for a bit of noise. Buildings of this sort sometimes, well, we've heard they're not permanent. Sometimes bits fall off them, holes appear, and there's a bit of emergency work going on up there. So apologies for some drilling and hammering noises from time to time. We'll try and rectify that for next week. So please come back for next week. You know what's coming up. It's going to be fantastic, as this morning was. 10 o'clock and 11:30 with a seminar in the afternoon at 2:30. So it now falls to me to thank Professor Jennings for these enormously rich, thoughtful, provocative and brilliant lectures. And we look forward to more next week. Thank you so much.